We are now going to look at the fall of the Russian Empire and the rise of the Soviet Union. And of course, the Soviet Union is the first communist country. So it's of great importance, as we will see. And communism, in a sense, during this time period is one of the main contenders for allegiance as opposed to capitalist liberal democracy, right? So remember, we talked about how there were many people who wanted to try and find a path towards modernity that would avoid the problems in capitalist liberal democracy, problems like economic inequality. Communism promised to bring modernity, the good things that come out of the four revolutions, without the economic inequality. So many people are going to become interested in communism as an alternative to capitalist liberal democracy. But in order to understand the rise of communism and the establishment of the Soviet Union, we need to talk a little bit about the Russian Empire, right? We need to give you some background information. Russia is a fascinating country, is extraordinarily complex. And one thing that makes it so complex is that it sort of fits in with Europe, it sort of fits in with Asia, and it's both and neither at the same time. But for our purposes, one thing we want to note about the Russian Revolution about the Russian Empire, is that in general, there was a refusal to have a thoroughgoing liberal democratic revolution. Right, so we talked about how Britain, the United States, France, and even to a certain extent Germany have had liberal democratic revolutions. Germany wasn't that liberal democratic, but did have some aspects of that. In contrast, Russia refused to, and for the most part, or I should say the Russian government for the most part, refused to have a liberal democratic revolution. It refused to take part in that political revolution we had talked about that helps make you so powerful. It did, however, while rejecting democracy and liberalism, did accept some aspects of nationalism. There was an emphasis in Russia on Russianness, and there was, even down to the peasants, there was a feeling that we are Russian, and that built a kind of unity. There was also, this was cemented with an emphasis on Orthodox Christianity. To be Russian was to be Orthodox Christian. And these kinds of loyalties, this kind of identity was united in the person of the Tsar, who ruled Russia as an absolute monarch. And effectively, for example, the Tsar served as the head of the Orthodox Christian Church in Russia. Now, while many people were united behind those ideas, behind that identity of Russianness, of Orthodox Christianity, these aspects of nationalism, there were people who did not like this system, who wanted to have a revolution, either, and this could range from a kind of anarchist revolution to a capitalist liberal democratic revolution to, as we'll see, the successful communist revolution. And so the Russian Empire under the Tsar was very good at using violence to suppress revolutionaries, right? So there is this kind of nationalism in a sense that will help bind people together, but this is an autocratic authoritarian government which uses violence to suppress its opponents. Now, it did to a certain degree accept the Industrial Revolution. Russia was not a empire where it was possible to have that happen naturally. Instead, it had to be sponsored by the state. So the state focused on industrialization in a few key cities. And there was a tendency, of course, for the most politically important cities to also be industrialized. That's going to be a really big deal later on, because it's that decision to focus industrialization in a few key cities that will help lead to the rise of communism. But in any case, at the beginning of the 20th century, there were many people in Russia who wanted change. There were people who wanted reform, but there were also who wanted to fix the system, to change the system. For example, maybe make Russia into a constitutional monarchy similar to Britain. But there were also people, revolutionaries, who wanted to completely overthrow the government as well. So there's going to be growing demands for change as we enter into the 20th century. Now, there will be multiple Russian revolutions, and what's key is what the army does. So in 1905, you may remember there was the Russo-Japanese War, and Japan ends up defeating Russia. And during the war is going so badly, and people are so frustrated that there's actually an attempted revolution during the war. However, during the war and during this revolution, the Russian army will stay loyal to the Tsar and put down the attempted revolution. Right. So the 1905 revolution fails because essentially the army stays loyal. However, in World War I, the Russian army was poorly supplied and experienced terrible losses, and it was also terribly led. So you had this army that, and you may recall I talked about how sometimes soldiers were sent into battle without guns, sometimes they were reduced to throwing stones, they often were not given enough rations, they really, and they were poorly led, they were led into many defeats by incompetent officers, and they were suffering huge losses. So what happened was eventually, in 1917, there would be a new revolution, and this time the army would turn against the regime, would turn against the Tsar, and Russia would become a republic. Right? In 1917, there would be a revolution, but one that made Russia into a republic. And this republic is serious about trying to form a liberal democracy. However, it also decides that it will continue the war. Right? It also decides that it will continue the war. And remember, the war was one reason why the army will support revolution. And this is going to be a problem for this liberal democracy, this decision to continue the war. So, communism is not supposed to happen in Russia, and it doesn't look like it's going to happen at this point, right? Because we have a republic in charge. We've gotten rid of the old government, the Tsar, we now have a republic. So how does communism happen in Russia when it's not supposed to? Remember, Karl Marx predicted that what would happen is, as a society became increasingly industrialized, there would be more and more workers, and they would be pushed and squeezed more and more by capitalists, by factory owners, to get them to do as much work as possible while paying them as low wages as possible. And eventually the workers would get sick of it. They would rebel. And because there were a lot of them, they would overcome. They would win the revolution. But Russia is not like that. Russia is only semi-industrialized with only a very few workers. So how can we talk about the workers taking over? Well, there was a man, a Russian named Vladimir Lenin, who wanted the workers to take over, who wanted to have a Russian revolution, who wanted to bring communism to Russia. So he had to figure out how to do that when Russia did not have this mass amount of workers who were being squeezed terribly by capitalists. And he developed the idea of a vanguard party. If you're not familiar with the concept of a vanguard, when an army marches, traditionally in old style like 19th, 18th century militaries, the front of the army was called the van. And the vanguard was the soldiers marching the front, leading the army. So his idea was that the Communist Party could act as a vanguard, as a leader to organize what workers there were, and then launch a successful revolution. Right? So to substitute for a mass amount of workers, you could have a party, Communist Party, that would organize workers and through their organization and discipline, launch the revolution. And that's exactly what they do. They will use the party and organized workers in industrialized cities. And remember that those cities where political power is concentrated to launch a successful communist revolution. They will win mass support with the promise of peace, land, and bread. They promise peace. We will end the war with Germany. They promise land, meaning that they're going to engage in land reform. They will give peasants ownership of land. And also they will make sure that people get fed. And this is a time when people are having a hard time getting enough to eat. And based on their discipline, their organization, the popular support they win with this slogan of peace, land, and bread, they're able to win a subsequent civil war. Right? There's going to be a civil war between people who support the Republic and people who want to bring back the Tsar and, of course, the communists. And foreign countries, United States, Japan, Great Britain will actually intervene against the communists. Despite this, the communists will win this civil war. And so they will form eventually a new government based on the old, on Russia plus its empire, called the Soviet Union. Right? So the Soviet Union is this new communist government. Now, while the communists had won based on this slogan of peace, land, and bread, once they are in power, they will start taking action against what is seen as class enemies. Right? So you remember how we talked about that there was this idea in communism that history is the progress of conflict between economic classes. You have an oppressor class and an oppressed class. So now, in order to bring about communism, we need to eliminate the oppressor class, right? We need to eliminate the oppressor class. Now, what's a little bit tricky about this, of course, is who belongs to the oppressor class when we're not in an advanced industrial society in which there are few factory owners and a lot of workers, right? So one thing that they did when they took power was the communists identified what were called kulaks, and kulaks were so-called rich peasants. And it's interesting, this picture on the left is a 1926 image, which is meant to help communists figure out who the kulaks are. The top house represents the home of a poor peasant. Notice that the house has thatch, kind of straw hay roofing, and it's got a little barn to the right which has some animals in it. Not quite clear what those are, perhaps goats or pigs. In the next picture down, there is a slightly wealthier peasant. Notice their house is a bit bigger, and they've got horses. The bottom house, where you can see where they have a lot of horses, they have a carriage, and they have a fairly nice house, those are kulaks. Kulaks were then considered class enemies. They were the oppressors. They had become wealthy supposedly by enriching themselves and on the backs of the poorer peasants, right? In communism, there's only the oppressed and the oppressors. If you're wealthy, you're part of the oppressor class. You could only have become wealthy by oppressing others. So how do you deal with these kulaks, these rich peasants who were so-called oppressors? Well, you can see this quote from Vladimir Lenin: "How can you make a revolution without executions? You execute these people." So in the name of class warfare, in the name of getting rid of the oppressor classes, the communists, initially even under Lenin at the very beginning, when they can, will start eradicating what they consider class enemies. Those who have become relatively wealthy based on the idea that you can only become wealthy by oppressing others. So again, it's not anything you necessarily did as an individual. Just by being a member of a class, you are guilty and you are liable for execution. Now, even though the communists will win the Civil War, they still are going to face a lot of difficulties. Between 1920 and 1922, 5 million lives will be lost in a famine. That's why the promise of bread was so important. The image you see on the left is a French attempt to raise food and funds to help starving children in Russia. In 1921, the Soviet Union was at 20% of pre-war industrial capacity. So in other words, they could only produce a fifth in 1921 of what they had been able to produce in 1914. So, if they could produce 10,000 rifles in 1914, they can now only produce 2,000. So they're facing serious difficulties. And Lenin, the guy, I'm not particularly a big fan of the guy because he thinks it's okay to go around shooting people because they happen to be fairly comparatively wealthy. But I do have to acknowledge he was a genius in terms of politics, brilliant political organizer. In 1924, he dies. So the Soviet Union is facing serious agricultural and industrial problems, and the leader that is kind of holding the revolution dies. So it's difficult to think about the Soviet Union even recover, let alone developing, right? So think about this. It's not simply an issue of developing the economy in this situation. How do you even get back to what you had before World War I? Very difficult problem that they face. And into that situation will come Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin is, I think, perhaps the most influential person of the 20th century. Not simply because he will be a key leader in the Soviet Union and help to communism to survive and thrive in a sense to a certain degree. He will influence other leaders that we'll talk about later, particularly Mao Zedong, the leader who will become the leader of communist China. So he's extraordinarily influential. He is possibly also one of the most evil men in history. It's amazing how he destroyed anyone that had pretty much anyone that offered even the most minimal threat to him, he would destroy. And just to give you an example of how callous he could be, he was really mean to his son, his first son, and his son attempted to shoot himself to commit suicide, but failed. And Stalin's reaction was, can't even shoot straight. So not exactly Father of the Year. However, again, just despite this, even though I may not like someone, doesn't mean I can't recognize their historical significance or their intelligence and ability. Stalin realized that he needed to industrialize quickly to strengthen the Soviet Union and to spread communism. Right? If the first communist government fails, it will probably be the last communist government. Right? So he realizes, I need to strengthen the Soviet Union. We need to complete the Industrial Revolution if we're going to become strong and survive and spread communism. And his answer, his solution to dealing with these problems is a centralized economy. Right? We don't have a lot of resources, so we need to make sure we use those resources efficiently. How are we going to do that? By centralizing everything, by making sure that the government is in control so it can make sure that resources are used efficiently. And part of this is the establishment of 5-year plans. So for example, they'll say, okay, in 5 years, we want to build this many tanks. To do that, we need this much steel. We need factories that are able to produce that steel. We need factories that can produce the rubber that you need. This is what we need to do if we're going to have this many tanks. And this allows for the efficient use of limited resources to engage in rapid industrialization, right? To give another example, right? We need this many factories that can produce steel. Okay, they need electricity. How are we going to get this electricity? Well, we need to build this many dams and this many power plants. Okay, how many railroads do we need to connect them all together? And they sit down and figure this all out, and they can then figure out how to efficiently use those resources. Now, this works really, really well. I want to stress, this works really, really well. It allows for very rapid industrialization. However, and this will become later, because it's focused on making the Soviet Union strong, the focus is on heavy industry. Things like, for example, steel, airplanes, tanks, that kind of thing. It does not focus on consumer goods. Those don't seem that important. So the Soviet Union will be able to industrialize very quickly, develop its heavy industry, but it won't focus that much on consumer goods. So you may say to yourself, well, geez, why do you think Stalin was such a bad guy if he was able to do this, right? I mean, he's able to industrialize quickly. He's able to strengthen the Soviet Union. I mean, isn't that great? Well, we need to see in a part how he did this, right? It wasn't just 5-year plans. Of course, there were other things that did it. So remember, I just explained how under this slogan of peace, land, and bread, the communists were able to get popular support, which helped them to win the Civil War. So during the Civil War, the peasants had been promised land if they supported the communists. However, once the communists win, the land was taken from the peasants and they became laborers on collective farms. So rather than have peasant families own and run their own farms, which they had been promised by the communists when the communists needed help, now the farms have been taken away from them, made into gigantic like plantations, where the peasants are merely laborers and the government tells them what to do, right? So you can see this is, again, why I have mentioned before, I'm not particularly fond of communism, because they told the peasants to get their support, we'll give you land. As soon as they got their support and didn't need them anymore, they took the land away from them. The idea of this was now the state could control farming and could make sure food was available for workers to support industrialization, right? The state could now make sure that it could control farming, could control output, and that way they could make sure that they had food to feed workers who were trying to undertake industrialization. So the idea here is, in a sense, you squeeze the farmers to get resources from them that you then use to industrialize. And also you didn't want to give the farmers very much food, just enough for them to hopefully continue farming. And if some of the older or weaker members died, who cares? And in the process of the collectivization farms, the resistance, forced, in a sense, starvation at times, and just the fact that this isn't terribly efficient, even though it does give the government control, about 7 to 14 million people will die. Stalin is fine with that. He doesn't care. These are probably people that were going to resist the regime anyway. And at least now we have the food to feed the workers so they can build up the Soviet Union. Right, but you can see why I'm not particularly fond of this guy. Say 14 million people killed, and we're not done yet. In addition, a lot of the workforce that made sure that the 5-year plans could be carried out successfully, and they were successful. I want to stress, Stalin's industrial development does work, right? My questioning is of the means. One thing that they will develop are what are called gulags. Gulags are prisons, and they could be for just regular prisoners like thieves or murderers and that kind of thing, but also for political dissidents. And just criticizing the government could get you, 5-10 years in prison. So there's going to be growing numbers of political prisoners, people who are prisoners not because they committed anything that would seem to people who are from the United States and who live in a free society see as a crime, but for saying things like, I don't like the government, I don't like this policy of collective farming. That was enough that could get you thrown into jail. And what happened was the gulags were used for forced labor. Right? Workers were taken from the gulags and forced to work on projects. So it's similar to a kind of, it's not quite slavery because they're not property, but the idea is you're taking these people and forcing them to work essentially for free for the government. And this is a picture of a dam that's being built, it's a canal that's being built in order to help facilitate transportation of goods. And this is being carried out by these workers who essentially are not being paid, and some of whom may be here just because they complain about the government. Right? So what makes this successful is this kind of extraction of labor for free. Right? These people are not paid, they're forced to do it. And you can always make sure that there's enough laborers because there's always going to be people who can be thrown in jail for just criticizing the government. Stalin will also develop what we call a cult of personality, where he will be presented as the all-wise, all-knowing leader who is everywhere and can see everything. And if you're familiar with the phrase, Big Brother is watching you, from George Orwell's 1948 book called 1984, that was why it's called 1984. It's a reversal of the year he wrote it in. You can get that sense that there's always this omnipresence of the great leader. He can see what you're doing, and if you do something wrong, he's going to come after you. Right? Now, Stalin is presented in a very friendly way here, right, as the kind of father of the people. That's part of the personality cult. He is great. He's always looking after us. And here you can see that this was not just in terms of propaganda, in that it was just a poster. This is a photograph of a communist meeting of young people in which you can see Joseph Stalin's portrait presented, hung up there, and this was common. Right? He seemed like he could see everything because he literally was everywhere. This guy's picture was everywhere. And so you had this kind of cult built around him as the all-knowing, all-powerful leader who was everything and could see everything. Now, how is that related to terror? Well, one thing that Stalin will do between the years 1936-38 is launch what's called the Great Purge, which is an attack on fellow communists. They will often be accused of being American spies or counter-revolutionaries or things like that, when in reality they are communists. They're people who believe in communism, but they may question Stalin's policies. They might be seen as Stalin as a possible threat, and he'll get rid of them. So, for example, those are 5 generals that were very high-ranking in the Red Army. Only 2 of them will survive the purges. The other 3 will be arrested and executed. Right? And this will actually make the army much weaker, which is really bad because this is right before World War II. But Stalin, in order to protect himself from anyone who could oppose him, will purge fellow communists, people who believe sincerely in communism often, who had done nothing wrong. He will accuse them of these outrageous things like being American spies and things like that, when in fact they aren't, simply because he sees them as a threat, simply because they disagree with him. And so that's what I mean by this rule by terror, right? People will be frightened. People will be scared. Stalin, when he dies in 1953, he has a stroke and basically is laying in his office for like 12 hours before he dies, and no one actually goes in to check on him because they're afraid that he's doing something, and that if they interrupt him, he'll have them killed. Right? When he would give a speech, they had to install a light that they would use as a signal so people knew when to stop clapping, because they were afraid that if they were the first ones to stop clapping, he might come after them. He might punish them. I mean, that's what I mean about rule by terror, right? You've got this great leader who's everywhere, who can see everything, and you never know what's going to happen. And even if you're a high person like these guys, you could fall, right? Even if you're a high person like these guys, he might come after you too. So in a sense, you're not safe. That's what I mean about rule by terror, right? You're not safe, so you better do what the great leader wants in hopes that somehow you'll be able to escape with your life. I don't expect you to remember these two names because I've given you a lot of names to remember, but I just want to give you a sense also of these people who were caught up in this. The woman on the left, Khadija Gayubova, she was a pianist. She was a woman who played piano. And her big crime was that she spoke a lot with people from Turkey. She met people with Turkey regularly, and that was enough to get her accused of being a spy. She was given a trial that lasted 15 minutes. That's right, a 15-minute trial. And then, even though there was no actual evidence to link that she'd actually been spying, she was shot. She was shot, this woman here. So even relatively small people, right? A pianist, a woman who plays piano, is such a threat that we need to arrest her, and without any kind of sufficient evidence to prove espionage, shoot her. That's very extreme. And the point is, when this kind of thing happens to people, this terrifies you, it encourages you to obey. And what's really striking to me is that the man who carried out Stalin's orders to do this, Nikolai Yezhov, he was the person who was basically put in charge by Stalin of the Great Purge, the one who actually did the purging. After he is no longer useful to Stalin, Stalin will also have him shot in 1940. Right? So in a sense, no one's safe. The high, the low, anyone can be in trouble. You can easily find yourself the subject of terror, the subject of government oppression. So you had better do what you are told. And so Stalin is going to help hold this together through the terror. And this is key to why he's able to industrialize and strengthen the Soviet Union. And I think this is what makes him kind of a controversial person, because especially if you're a Russian, this guy managed to strengthen Russia. As we'll see, even though in many ways his Great Purge is going to hurt Russia in terms of its military, he does build up an industrial base that helps the Soviet Union stand against the Nazis. So he does help make Russia/Soviet Union into a powerful country. On the other side, the means that he followed to do this are terrible. And the fact that he just would kill people left and right into the millions to accomplish his goals, and even just to avoid any kind of possible resistance or questioning of his regime is just astounding. One thing that's kind of interesting about Stalin was that his mom really wanted him to be a priest, and he actually went to seminary for a while, but then became interested in radical ideas, and that's what led him to communism. And after he was successful, and when he was killing all these people, his mother, who was like the one person who could actually question him, said maybe it would have been better if you would have become a priest because, you're killing all these people. But just similar to what we saw with Mexico, right? There's this concern about organized religion, that religion is dangerous. In communism in particular, religion is seen as the opiate of the masses, right? Why? Well, an opiate, remember we talked about the Opium War, is something that makes you calm and relaxed. And the idea is that religion teaches people, you know what, your life may be difficult here, but don't fight back, just endure it, and later you'll be rewarded in the afterlife. So communists saw religion as something that prevented people from engaging in revolution. Right? From a communist perspective, because remember, communism is an atheistic philosophy. There's no God. You're promising people an afterlife that doesn't exist in order to oppress them in this life to get them to accept a terrible circumstance. So religion is dangerous. And also similar to the Mexican, or the people in Mexico who were supporting this new constitution of 1917, it was seen as the reason for the backwardness of the country. It was seen as causing superstition and as preventing the government, or preventing modernization. And just like Mexico, remember, part of a major supporter of the old order was Orthodox Christianity, right? The Tsar was essentially head of the Orthodox Church. So this is the main support of the old order, and if anyone wants to rebel, they're going to do it in the name probably of Orthodox Christianity, and a lot of the resistance to the communists actually came from Orthodox Christians who were very serious about their faith. And in addition, communism understood itself as bringing the true way the society should be organized, right? We're right, the old order is wrong, so we need to get rid of it completely. So as part of that, you had propaganda. On the left there, you'll notice there's some workers who are dumping Jesus like into a sewer, right? It's interesting. There's also alcohol and other things kind of representing the old order. And you can see a worker there tearing apart a church bell. And then you can see a highly industrialized Russia in the back. That's kind of the idea. So as a way of clearing away the old order that misleads the people so they won't engage in revolution, and so that now the path will be clear to bring a true communist society, public worship will be suppressed. Oftentimes, churches will be turned into other uses like museums or schools or sometimes lavatories. And a huge number of priests, monks, and nuns will also be executed, something like several tens of thousands. Right. So in a sense, we see here what we saw in Mexico, but even more so, right? Even a fiercer, stronger attempt to root out religion. Now, a lot of the things I just talked about were not widely known outside the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was very careful to control the flow of information both in and out of the country. So a lot of the excesses of the gulags, a lot of the executions were not really known. What instead was seen was that the Soviet Union appeared to be industrializing successfully, becoming a wealthy, powerful country, while avoiding the inequalities that you had in capitalist liberal democracy. So because of this, many people became interested in communism outside the Soviet Union. It seemed at last there was an opportunity to follow a new path outside of capitalist liberal democracy and avoid all the problems that come along with capitalist liberal democracy. And we have to remember that especially after the stock market crash and the resulting Great Depression of 1929, there are a lot of problems in capitalist liberal democracy. In addition, the communists will present themselves as the friend of anti-imperialism, right? They will present themselves as not being a part of those imperialist capitalist liberal democracies like Britain, France, the United States. They will argue that they are in fact anti-imperialist. Now, I think there are some problems with this. I think that in many ways the Soviet Union behaved just like an empire. They, for example, did not liberate areas of the Russian Empire. They kept the whole empire. They just called it the Soviet Union. But in any case, they were successful as presenting themselves as anti-imperialist and as being a good alternative to capitalist liberal democracy. So how does that relate? Well, let me give you an example. The Soviet Union promised to give up its old rights in China, right? Russia had, like all the other countries, the Western imperial countries in Japan, had unequal treaties with China, in which those countries had advantages in China, but China did not get any advantages in the other country. So the Soviet Union promised to give up its old rights in China. Now, it didn't keep those promises, but it did make the promise. And this led to many Chinese people being interested in communism because they said, oh, those capitalist liberal democracies, they really treated us badly at Versailles. They don't really believe in capitalist liberal democracy, or at least in any kind of real freedom. They just want to oppress us. They just are empires who want to come in and take over. So based on that belief, many Chinese were interested in communism because the communists seemed like the real deal. The communists seemed like they presented, like I said, this alternative to capitalist liberal democracy without the imperialism. So if you're a country like China, which is suffering from imperialism, and in which there are problems arising out of economic inequality, and those problems seem like they will continue as China goes down a kind of a capitalist road, you're going to be interested. And because Chinese people are interested in this, the Soviet Union, which is very savvy politically, will send support, both in terms of leadership and money, and help organize the Chinese Communist Party, which will come into existence in 1921 and which rules China today. Right? So the Soviet Union, it seems to be this great alternative to capitalist liberal democracy. It seems to be anti-imperialist. What's not to like? And so some Chinese people will embrace communism. And one of the key people is a man named Mao Zedong. We'll talk more about him later, but he is eventually going to become the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, and then for quite a long time, for about almost 3 decades, the leader of Communist China. But one thing I really want to stress here, do you remember how earlier I said that there was a conflict between nationalism and communism because nationalism says that your national identity is the most important thing, but communism says your most important thing is your class. What we see going on in practical terms is the overcoming of the theoretical division between communism and nationalism. For nationalists such as Mao Zedong is a nationalist. He wants to build a strong, powerful China. Communism is a means for obtaining national liberation. Communism promises to, because it's anti-imperialist, because it's an alternative route to modernity, it promises to make China strong. Right? So while theoretically communism and nationalism are at odds because communism emphasizes class loyalty, whereas nationalism emphasizes national loyalty, as we can see in the case of China and Mao Zedong, communism was seen by many people, like I said, particularly by Mao Zedong, as a means for obtaining national liberation while avoiding the problems that appeared in capitalist liberal democracies as well as their imperialism. And that's why Mao Zedong and other communists will fight Chiang Kai-shek in the Civil War. They have a different vision of what China should look like. Right? They have a communist vision, which is very different from Chiang Kai-shek, who was stridently anti-communist. So in conclusion, in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, authoritarian politics are on the rise. Right? Even though liberal democracy, capitalism will be the victors of World War I, their victory is kind of hollow because they just killed a whole bunch of each other. And because after the Great Depression hits, it seems like they're not able to get out of it. It seems like a kind of dead end. Right? Many are going to attempt a political revolution outside of capitalist liberal democracy in the name of national independence and or in an attempt to find a modernity without the problems of the capitalist liberal democracies. And almost every one of these solutions is based on authoritarianism, on governments getting more power, not less, with the idea that a powerful government is best able to reorganize society to make it strong, to overcome imperialism, and so forth. This is often done through the idea of a party that controls a state and does not allow dissent in the name of economic development. Right? The Communist Party in the Soviet Union, to a lesser extent, Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party and the Industrial Revolutionary Party. And we have to stress, even Gandhi, who we kind of, he's a good guy because he's not using violence and he believes in freedom and tolerance and so forth. Remember, even he organizes the Indian National Congress into a mass party, because that will give power to the people, to the nation state, or to the nation so they can get independence. We also see there's challenges to traditional ideas of capitalism, free markets, and free trade, as we saw with the Soviet Union, as we saw with the Industrial Revolutionary Party, right? We see that the rise of socialism and communism. And we also see that many people in this time period saw religion as an obstacle, as something that was superstitious, but also as an alternative source of authority that was often powerful in society and could be used to resist this new government. And I want to emphasize this because there's often this view, well, religion causes violence. And I wanted to point out here that sure, you can point to real cases of religion causing violence. There is plenty of secular-based violence as well, as we have seen in this section, and which we will see when we get into World War II, the following section.